Welcome to today's Explainer. Look, today we're stepping into a completely defining, deeply consequential chapter of American history. We're diving into a conflict so vast, so incredibly violent, that it literally altered the DNA of the nation. We're going to examine not just the battlefields themselves, but the wildly different leadership styles that shaped them, and, of course, the devastating realities endured by soldiers and their families on the ground. It's heavy stuff for sure, because the stakes of the American Civil War were quite literally the survival of the United States itself.
Think about this number for a second. 600,000. That is the staggering total of American deaths in this conflict. Actually, to really put that catastrophic human toll into perspective, more Americans died in the Civil War than in all other U.S. wars combined, all the way up until Vietnam. It's one of those numbers that just forces you to pause, right? To reckon with the absolute, utter devastation that was required to keep a fractured nation together.
All right, Section 1, America's Deadliest Divide. Now, what's honestly kind of bizarre looking back is that when the war first broke out, the mood was almost festive. People in Washington, D.C. literally packed up picnic baskets and rode out in carriages to watch the Battle of Bull Run. They fully expected this quick, entertaining little skirmish. But as you can guess, that naive optimism violently crashed into grim reality the second the fighting actually began.
That whole picnic mood? Yeah, it vanished instantly. Just consider this incredibly visceral quote from a soldier at the Battle of Antietam. I mean, try to imagine the sheer, horrifying volume of casualties required for someone to observe that a man could walk from one end of the field to the other without ever touching the ground. It was an unprecedented level of violence, and the American public was entirely unprepared for it.
And the hardships for the soldiers and their families went way, way beyond the bullets. Down at the siege of Vicksburg, Confederate soldiers ran entirely out of food. They were reduced to eating mules, dogs, and eventually, rats. And Antietam's sunken road, which became known as Bloody Lane, wave after wave of men were mowed down until bodies were literally stacked 3 deep. And up at Gettysburg, the fighting devolved into this ruthless, desperate hand-to-hand combat in the pitch dark. This absolutely wasn't some gentleman's war. It was pure survival.
Moving on to Section 2, the tactician versus the grinder, because ultimately the outcome of the war and the fate of millions of people would come down to this dramatic clash between two vastly different military titans.
The contrast in their leadership styles honestly couldn't be any starker. On the Union side, you've got Ulysses S. Grant. His entire philosophy is basically summed up by his famous response to a Confederate commander: no terms except unconditional and immediate surrender. He never panicked, he just pushed. And on the Confederate side, you have Robert E. Lee. Lee was this polished West Point graduate, a celebrated tactical genius. In fact, Abraham Lincoln originally offered Lee command of the Union Army, but Lee chose to fight for his home state of Virginia instead. So these two sides collided in just monumental ways. Take the Battle of Antietam. After a Union soldier literally stumbled upon a lost copy of Lee's battle plans, which were wrapped around some cigars, believe it or not. The resulting fight led to 23,000 casualties in a single day, the bloodiest day in American history. But that horrific day gave the Union just enough strategic momentum for Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. This was a massive game changer. It made the war explicitly about ending slavery, and it opened the door for nearly 200,000 black men to enlist and fight.
Then, the year 1863 rolls around and fundamentally turns the tide of the war across two very different fronts. Over in the east, at Gettysburg, Lee's massive, chaotic assaults totally failed to break the Union line over 3 grueling days of combat. Meanwhile, out west at Vicksburg, Grant tried something borderline insane. He made a daring midnight gunboat run right past Confederate cannons in the pitch dark, and it actually worked. It allowed him to completely starve out the last Confederate fortress on the Mississippi River.
That failure at Gettysburg, though, it weighed incredibly heavily on the South. On the third day, Lee ordered this massive 12,000-man assault known as Pickett's Charge. It was a complete slaughter. Less than half of those men returned uninjured. When Lee rode out to meet the survivors of that disastrous gamble, tears were streaming down his face, and he just quietly muttered to himself, "It's all my fault." Which brings us to Section 3, Grant's relentless strategy. With the tide finally turning, Lincoln found his guy. He promoted Ulysses S. Grant to command all Union armies. And Grant? He brought this brutal, unyielding approach to the Eastern Theater, taking the fight directly to Lee's doorstep in Virginia. See, Grant's strategy relied on sheer, exhausting attrition. He just kept grinding.
In the wilderness, they fought in smoke so thick, men could barely even see each other. At Spotsylvania, the gunfire was so intense it actually cut down an oak tree 2 feet thick. Even after a disastrous assault at Cold Harbor, where 7,000 Union soldiers fell in under an hour, Grant didn't retreat like past Union generals would have. He kept pushing south, eventually pinning Lee's starving army down in a grueling 9-month trench siege at Petersburg.
Now, the human cost of Grant's strategy was staggering, so much so that northern newspapers started branding him the Butcher for the tens of thousands of Union lives being lost. But Lincoln? He fiercely defended his general. He famously said, "I can't spare this man, he fights." Lincoln understood that Grant was really the first commander willing to absorb the horrific cost actually required to win the war.
But while Grant is locking horns with Lee in the east, a radically different nightmare was unfolding for both soldiers and civilians out west. This is Section 4, the nightmare of total war. And this dramatic shift in strategy was spearheaded by General William T. Sherman.
Now, to understand Sherman's campaign, we really have to wrap our heads around the concept of total war. Sherman realized that just defeating the enemy's army wasn't going to be enough. To end the rebellion, you had to break the civilian and societal will to keep fighting. The target wasn't just guys in uniform anymore, it was the entire infrastructure supporting them.
And Sherman was completely uncompromising about this. He stated plainly, war is cruelty. The crueler it is, the sooner it'll be over. He firmly believed there was absolutely no use in trying to reform or somehow soften war. To Sherman, maximum destruction was simply the fastest path to peace. So, he put that philosophy into apocalyptic practice. After capturing and burning Atlanta, which, by the way, gave the North a massive morale boost that helped secure Lincoln's re-election, Sherman proposed a really radical idea. He marched his 60,000-man army 300 miles to the Atlantic Ocean. Moving in these massive columns 60 miles wide, they ripped up railroads, burned down factories, and lived entirely off the land. They brought the sheer devastation of the war directly to the doorsteps of Confederate families. And as they carved this massive path of destruction, they also liberated thousands of enslaved people who joined the march singing songs of freedom. It completely, utterly gutted the South's morale.
All right, Section 5, Dignity in Surrender. By 1865, the Confederate military apparatus was completely exhausted. The violence was finally drawing to a close, and it gave way to some really profound moments of humanity.
The end played out like a rapid domino effect. In 1865, Union forces broke through at Five Forks, completely severing Lee's last supply line. Petersburg finally falls. Then, the Confederate capital of Richmond falls, actually burning to the ground after fleeing officials set fire to their own warehouses. Lee desperately fled west with his starving men, but Grant cut off every single bridge and road. Lee was completely surrounded at Appomattox. Left with literally no other options, Lee asked for a meeting. And the visual contrast of these two commanders at Appomattox Court House, it's incredibly striking. Grant arrives in an exhausted, mud-stained uniform, looking like a guy who hadn't slept in days. Lee, on the other hand, shows up in his absolute finest dress uniform with every single button polished to a shine. He was sending a clear message. He might be defeated, but he was going to surrender with dignity. Their physical appearances just perfectly embody the end of their respective, grueling journeys.
But what is truly remarkable here are the incredibly generous terms Grant offered. No executions, no treason trials, no revenge. He allowed the paroled soldiers to keep their horses for the spring planting, and officers got to keep their sidearms. When Lee quietly mentioned his men were starving, Grant, without a second of hesitation, provided 25,000 rations. As Lee rode back to his men, with tears streaking down their faces, he simply removed his hat in a final, emotional salute. The deadliest conflict in American history was officially over.
But there's a deeply tragic coda to this story. Just 5 days after Lee's surrender, Abraham Lincoln was attending a play at Ford's Theater. That's where Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth slipped into the presidential box and assassinated him. The timing, it's almost too painful to comprehend. Lincoln had just guided America through its darkest hour, preserved the Union, and struck the chains from 4 million enslaved people, only to die before he could see the nation actually begin to heal. Which leaves us with this pretty powerful thought. Out of the ashes of those 600,000 lost lives, the United States was given what many consider a second chance. A chance to truly live up to the founding ideal that all men are created equal. So, given the ultimate cost paid by so many on those battlefields, have we fully lived up to the ideals they died for? Thank you so much for exploring this vital history with me in today's Explainer. Keep learning and keep reflecting.